Hello everybody, we're here at the Paterson Museum. This is our big exhibit on diners and hot Texas wieners, Orders Up. That's the name of the show here. And we have a very special guest, Malcolm Cooper, who is a member of the Cooper family that owned and operated the Silk City Diner business, which was a division of the Paterson Vehicle Company. So Malcolm, welcome. Thank you. It's an honor to have you here today in Paterson.
This is a treat for me
to
come back to the roots. Malcolm Everett Cooper Jr. So my father was the youngest of the boys in the Cooper family.
6 of them.
Pardon?
6 of them, yes?
Yes.
6 boys.
And he was Malcolm Everett Cooper.
And Everett Abbott is the patriarch.
Exactly.
Yes, we got a picture of him.
And I think Everett Abbott's father was Abbott Everett.
Oh, okay. Well, we just keep alternating. That's the way it goes.
My father talked often of growing up in New Jersey and of his relationship with his brothers and the company, but he chose not to enter the company. He was the youngest. Some say maybe an afterthought. I think he was 20 plus years younger than his oldest brother.
Oh, okay.
And the only one that went to college.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't talk that much about his youth, but I know he was sent to live with a relative in Hackensack and went to Hackensack High because they felt it was a better school than Paterson for some reason.
Okay.
So,
all right.
And then when he got out of Hackensack High, he went to Lehigh and studied industrial engineering because he'd grown up in an industrial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But he told lots of stories about his family. The only ones I really met were Fred, his brother Fred, and Fred's wife Peg. They would come to Vermont in the fall.
Okay.
But all the brothers worked in the company except him.
That's right. My friend Les Cooper, his father was Irving.
Right.
And I think Irving was one that actually, he designed the undercarriage of a diner, which would make it very easy to actually pick it up and move it somewhere. So I think that was him. So now, as I recall, it started out as the Paterson Wagon Company in Suffern, New York. Does that sound right? And then moved to Paterson, and then it was reorganized into the Paterson Vehicle Company. So
And
you
I
have some
heard
insights there?
I heard a story that stuck in my mind about the Paterson Wagon Company, which built sleighs and buggies.
Right.
And they partnered up with a company in Cortland, New York, the Cortland Wagon Company.
Okay.
So my grandfather co-signed a note for expansion or for capital acquisition of the Cortland Wagon Company.
Oh, I never heard this story.
And ended up being dragged into bankruptcy.
When I was doing my research, I found a New York Times article that said the Paterson Wagon Company was coming out of bankruptcy and had reorganized as a Paterson Vehicle Company.
And it came out of bankruptcy under the protection of Chapter 11.
Okay, 1906 or so, something like that, 1908.
And according to my dad, it was so stressful, his father ended up having a heart attack during that period.
Oh.
But like most businessmen do today, even though he was protected under, this is tongue-in-cheek, protected under Chapter 11,
right.
He spent the rest of his life slowly repaying all the outstanding debts that he'd been unable to pay. And by the time he died, he'd paid back everybody that he defaulted during his bankruptcy. That was just his attitude. He thought, the law doesn't require me to do this, but I owe these people money. So he reorganized, restarted the business, became quite successful, and paid off all the debts that had been, Chapter 11 relieved you of your debts.
All right, very, very noble, a gentleman for sure.
In that day and age.
Yeah. Now, the Paterson Vehicle Company, as we've explored here at the museum, built a lot of truck and car bodies, and some of those vehicles actually used Edison batteries. They were electric vehicles. So,
in the pictures you sent, I saw.
Yeah.
And the story I heard about that phase of the business was several of the boys would take a train to Detroit and pick up a chassis, which was basically the cab, the engine, and the frame, and maybe put another one on the back or hook it up, bobtail, and drive them to Paterson. So the 3 boys would go out and come back with 6 chassis. And then they would go to work building you know, the custom body.
Mm-hmm.
As I saw in the pictures, I didn't realize how many different ones, but you know, buses, trolleys, hearses, lumber carts, delivery trucks, flatbeds.
Yeah.
Dad told me about the, you know, as a kid hanging around, he always liked the blacksmith shop, and he said when they were fitting brackets to these wooden, lots of wood was used, but there was metal, they would heat them up, if they were putting a brace in, they would heat it up red hot, and then they would put it in position and burn it into the wood and then put the rivets or the bolts in. So when we were kids, we had a banister in our all-purpose room coming up from the garage, and Dad insisted on getting a little torch and heating up these brackets and then burning them. And my mother freaked out. The house is full of smoke. But he said that's the best fit. If you burn it, it really makes it a tight fit, and then you can tighten up the bolts with it.
Now, this must have been a pretty sophisticated manufacturing operation at its day. It was probably leading edge technology at the time. Have you heard stories? I mean, were the six brothers, were they all engineers? Were they industrial?
I think they were. None of them had been formally trained. I think they were all self-taught. And, you know, maybe Dad talked about trade schools and you know, how much shop training that you would get in even primary and high school, and he loved that. He was fascinated with printing, and he ran a little printing press as a boy called the Pheasant Tail Press, and I think we still have the press. It was a little manual thing. You put the paper in, pull a lever, it would ink up a roller, it would roll. I mean, very crude, and he printed birthday cards and so forth. And so the boys, I think, grew up in a household full of people that made stuff.
Yeah.
Well,
Paterson
did things with their hands.
This was a manufacturing center at the time. Much. I'm sure Alexander Hamilton would have been very, very happy that it came about, because this was his idea of an American city that was going to be a big business.
Maybe it's in the blood, because I'm very much of a mechanical. You know, I'm self-taught. I don't have any formal training, but I've always been somebody that takes apart their engines and puts them back together and rebuilds things. And you know, I've taught myself to become a welder. People think I'm a woodworker because I work in this woodworking business, but I'm really not as much of a woodworker as I'm a metal machinery person. But I spent 50 years breathing sawdust in the wood factory, so my evenings I'm not that interested in making wood products. I'm really not that accomplished a woodworker, but I'm sort of a self-styled mechanic. And I wonder if there's some genetic thing that goes through the family. I have a good dad used to talk about 3D visualization and ability to see things in 3D. Some people have a better capability than others, and I think I have that. I can see something and draw it in 3 dimensions.
Well, back in those days, most of these people were self-taught. They learned as they went along. I'm sure there weren't a lot of
I was just reading this morning about some of these people. I've just taken a quick tour through the museum. I mean, inventing these incredibly complicated things that no formal training at all, with a blacksmith anvil and a hammer.
Yeah. Well, you were walking through the museum before. There's all those the looms and the mills for the silk operations.
Right.
This building, the Paterson Museum, this building itself is very historic. A lot of locomotives were built here.
Right.
The locomotive that was the Transcontinental Railroad, where they met somewhere and they did the Golden Spike. The locomotive from our side, from the east, was built here. That's again, that's think of all the engineering and what you have to know to make all this stuff work.
There's that fabulous book. It was a very well illustrated coffee table book about building a locomotive.
I don't know.
I found one on eBay because I missed it. I lost. Look for it. You can find it, and it shows very well, beautifully illustrated pictures of every step, casting these huge parts for the wheels and the chassis. And I've still got it. It's how a locomotive was built. Right. With pretty crude technology to produce a pretty amazing machine.
It was amazing with the things that they built. Now, as I remember from my research, around 1925, 26, 27, one of the brothers had gotten wind of this new craze that was going on with diners. And he wanted to establish a Silk City Diner division within Paterson Vehicle Company. Do you have any recollection of that?
All I remember in sort of that speaks to that era was that the Ford Motor Company by then was, you know, in full on mass production, producing thousands of passenger vehicles a week.
In Detroit, not in
In
Paterson.
Detroit. And there were other ones all over the country.
Yeah,
Ford was
yeah,
by
yeah.
far the biggest.
Right.
And so apparently my grandfather knew Henry Ford because he bought a lot of, you know, he would buy, you know, he probably bought hundreds of these chassis over the course of the Paterson Vehicle Company's life. So he knew Henry Ford.
Okay.
Henry Ford was a business associate, but so Ford said, you know, the way I recall the history, and this is, you know, maybe
This is
creating some
family
of my
lore.
said, you know, I think I'm going to start mass producing some trucks. I've got these companies all over the country that are doing this, and I think I can do it better, cheaper, because I know how to mass produce, and I've got the capital to mass produce a lot, because I'm sending chassis to California, to Texas, to New Jersey. So I'm going to set up a division to build trucks, or, you know, buses or whatever. And I need somebody that's had a lot of experience to help me. So we approached my grandfather and said, would you be willing to come to Detroit, take a stake in the business? You know, maybe I'll give him some stock or something, whatever it would be. And because you know how to build these, and you know, what I know how to build is, this is Henry speaking, what I know how to build is automobiles, you know, passenger vehicles. Mm-hmm. And we'll start mass producing bus bodies or hearses or whatever. And my grandfather said, I don't think it'll work. Every town, every region has, you know, sort of unique needs. They want theirs looking a certain way, a certain color, a certain, you know, Henry Ford was famous initially for saying you can have a Model T any color you want as long as it's black.
As long as it's black, yeah.
And so my grandfather said, no, I'm not going to help. I'm going to stick with, we got something going here that's a good thing. And hey, apparently a guy named Fisher agreed, mm-hmm. Body by Fisher.
Still
Body
today,
by,
yeah.
probably don't remember.
I've heard this, Les Cooper has told, I think, the same story, so I think you're spot on with this.
So I think we missed the boat there, but
well,
I would have been, you know, spent my life living in Grosse Pointe and working and
yeah.
growing up in Michigan. So.
Well, who knows?
And so you're asking about the decline of the Paterson Vehicle Company. I think it had to do with maybe Ford coming on with
right.
mass production as well as
right.
the interest in dining. So what year would you think that they started building the diners?
I recall it was around, one of the brothers had served in World War I,
right.
and then came back and was involved in some various manufacturing businesses, and he had this idea of going into the diner business, because the diner business at that time was up and coming. Jerry O'Mahony was building diners in Bayonne, and he was doing very well. So one of the brothers thought that, well, we got all this experience.
We got a shop.
We got a shop. We built all these, you know, truck bodies.
Basically the same technology.
Same technology, same manufacturing capabilities. Let's explore the diner business. So I think there was a period of maybe 2 or 3 years where they were sort of ramping up and testing models and things like that, and doing blueprints. And then I think it was 27 when they first started offering their very first Silk City diners.
And so when did the Depression hit in 1929?
Yeah.
And my dad was scarred by the Depression, but the diners did pretty well during it.
The diners did well because at that time, going out to eat was sort of a radical concept. Right. Rich people went out to eat, but you could eat at a diner. You could bring your family, and you could have basic, wholesome American food at a reasonable price. And now this is also the period in that 1929, 1930, 31. This is when New Jersey was investing in all this infrastructure that we have here. So bridges, tunnels, roads. That was the conduit that fed the diner business. These were the hungry travelers on the road. When the car was really taking off as the primary mode of transportation, New Jersey was the corridor state.
Really?
And so and people were in their cars with the family.
The Garden
They're
State Parkway.
driving, you know, and hey, you know, we're kind of hungry, and it's a nice diner.
We all still joke where I live in Vermont. We meet somebody from New Jersey, and the question is not where do you live, but which exit.
Yeah. Exit 153 for me.
So yeah, I think, and the Depression, you know, was people didn't have much money, and my father was working in New York, so he got out of college in 1933 with a degree in industrial engineering and really didn't know what else to do. And his father, so right in the depths of the Depression, and he got a job working in New York City for Citibank Farmers Trust as a clerk.
Okay.
So, because there was no real work for him back at the Paterson Vehicle Company, they were so tight. None of the brothers were taking salaries. They were working, working for free to keep the place open. And he managed, and I think his father pulled some strings, got him this job. So he lived in New York all during that period, and went to night school and got a law degree. He was very ambitious. But he said lots of people were doing it. People were so, so scarred and traumatized by this depression.
This is your dad now?
My dad.
Yeah. And then what about?
That'll come
Okay.
later. So now he's in New York, 10 years working in New York, going to law school at night. For 6 years, he gets a law degree from NYU, admitted to the bar, and that all was interrupted by the start of World War II.
Okay.
But during that period, he worked as a banker, worked in finance, so all these things set him up for eventually his career as a manufacturer and a business owner.
In Vermont?
In Vermont.
Okay.
So, but he said the thing about the Depression for the diners is the mom and pop who were, could scrape up maybe $1,000 or $500, I can't remember what it was. Apparently the Paterson Vehicle, the Silk City Diner was fairly unique in that they agreed to finance, internal finance.
A lot of the diner builders did that. They were the go-between between the diner owner and the
people
bank.
couldn't get any credit.
No, they couldn't get credit. So they put up they were the security.
So they would take, whatever the down payment was, move a diner onto this, so for very little capital investment, you could have a restaurant.
Right.
And dad could cook and mom could wait on the table and the kid would be over in the corner and they could be up and going. They worked 24 hours a day.
Yes,
But
yes.
they'd have some income. College educated people were selling pencils and selling apples. I didn't grow up, and my father pointed out many times how terrible the Depression was, and I said, it's not my fault. I grew up in the boom 60s, a spoiled, rotten kid. I would have figured out a way, I think, to get through. We all would have gotten through the Depression. We didn't, because it really traumatized lots of people. And he saw people that really were very well educated, very able, just couldn't find jobs. So the people who could get a diner together could have a business and make some money.
It was a family business, and they took a lot of pride in owning the business.
Absolutely.
This was their business. Now, people have told me, well, if you run a diner, you're not going to make millions of dollars, but you'll never starve. You'll always have. There'll always be somebody who want to stop in for a cup of coffee or a sandwich or a piece of pie.
Right.
So,
And you're buying food.
And you're buying
So
food.
there's always, at the end of the day, there's an egg left or something.
that's right. And the early diner owners, maybe they were in other professions which got dried up because of the Depression, but they liked the idea of owning the business. They took a lot of pride in owning the business.
I think my father succumbed to the same problem here. He wanted to own a business.
This was a woodworking company?
It's a woodworking company.
Okay.
A wood manufacturing company that he bought a 50%, I don't know, get the timeline screwed up here, but he bought a 50% interest in the company.
Right.
In the fall of 1949. He bought a house in Dorset, Vermont, and he had his first child.
Okay.
That'd be me. And for the rest of his life, he debated which was the best acquisition. I was either 2 or 3, or 3 or 2, but I was never 1. He had this little business, a beautiful house, which my brother now lives in, a magnificent property. He paid $12,000 for the 50% of the business, $15,000 for the house and 10 acres. And I think the cost of my hospital birth was something like $38. We still have that. And we moved to Dorset in the fall of '49, the year I was born. And J.K. Adams was the name of the owner, Josiah Adams, who was a New York banker who had connections in New England because he had a son that went to Dartmouth and a daughter that went to Bennington College. And driving between the two would go right through Dorset. And I don't know whether either of you have been to Dorset, but it's a very charming little, like right out of Courier and Ives.
Have to go.
So, Joe Adams, saw Dorset, bought a little house there, needed something to do. there was a woodworking business that had burned in another town with a product line, kids' toys, pull toys on a string, like little racing cars and little trains. And so he bought the product line, set it up in a 2-car garage, called it the J.K. Adams Company. He was a good salesman. He was a financial guy, not a manufacturer at all. My dad, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself, but my dad had grown up in Paterson. And on the main street in Paterson was a sporting goods store named CB Sports. That was the name of the store. It was Charles Bird Vaughn. He sold fishing rods, baseball gloves, whatever kids would buy, tennis rackets back in the 1900s for sports. And if you really want me to give you the details, one of Charles Vaughn's children, Alice Vaughn, married a guy who was sort of a radical, I think he wasn't a communist, but he was more of a socialist at the new school at NYU, maybe.
Okay.
And his name was Scott Nearing, and Scott Nearing was publishing radical thought about, how the world was going to hell in the Depression. Let's see, what year would this have been? Probably during the McCarthy era. So he was going to homestead and move to Vermont. So he bought a piece of land in Vermont. You could get land for nothing, and started, raised some sheep back to the land. There have been waves of these back to the land. Somebody pointed out to me recently when I was describing the story, they said it's always easier to be a back to the land hippie when you've got a little trickle fund in the background, which it turns out Scott Nearing did, but he wrote a book that became a bestseller, like 5 Acres in Independence or something.
Okay.
But they moved to this town in Vermont, right near Dorset, and Scott Nearing's wife was Helen Vaughn, and Helen Vaughn had grown up in Paterson, and Helen now is living in Winhall, Vermont, and sees this new development coming into the area. Bromley ski area, Stratton ski area, Magic Mountain, Stowe, Killington. This big ski boom is happening in New England. This is now the 50s, late 40s, 50s. She calls up her brother, Chuck Vaughn, who lives in Paterson, and said, you ought to come up. It's a beautiful place to live, and maybe you don't want to be a sheep farmer and make maple syrup. So he moved up and built one of the first ski lodge motels in town to capitalize on this new ski boom business. The town we live in is adjacent to Bromley Mountain, which was, it's one of the older ski areas in Vermont, built by Fred Pabst, whose father had a brewery out in Milwaukee. So we had a pretty good trickle fund of cash to help him.
This is the unknown connection between Vermont and Paterson.
Paterson. So Nearing is there. Now his sister moves up, her brother moves up, starts the hotel, and he gets to know the people in town, and he meets Joe Adams.
Okay.
And he was buddies with my dad from growing up in Paterson. My dad is just mustered out of the Army after a 6-year career as a soldier in the military. And is at loose ends, doesn't quite know what to do. Didn't want to go back to the bank in New York. He saw New York banking as he said it's an Ivy League elite closed door to certain people. My father, I thought, was very bright, very well spoken, very well dressed, but he said a blue collar boy out of Paterson is not going to make it to the upper reaches of Wall Street, which I never understood. I think that probably was the case.
Yeah.
So we wanted to do something else, and he had a background in Paterson in manufacturing. So somehow Chuck Vaughn knew my father was at loose ends. He married my mom when he was 40, and they rented an apartment in Pittsfield, Mass, where she was from, and he was camped out looking. He bought a little farm during the war in Red Hook, and he thought maybe he'd be a farmer. But he saw problems developing there. That was going to be a hard road to hoe. His father, my grandfather, actually oversaw the farm towards the end of his life in Red Hook. Had apple orchards and some cows. Chuck Vaughn calls him and says, there's a guy up here named Joe Adams, has a little business, and he's about to go broke. He needs help. He needs manufacturing help, and he needs some capital. So my father came out and met Joe Adams, and I think between Christmas and New Year's in 1948, they signed the articles of incorporation and joined as partners in the J.K. Adams Company.
Yes.
And about 4 or 5 years later, Joe and he just couldn't see eye to eye. Joe was a bit of a dilettante, and my father was a workaholic. He thought there's 7 days in a week, 24 hours a day. Sleep is overrated. Why? Do you need to sleep? He just worked all the time. And Joe said, I want to go play golf on Saturday and Sunday. So they parted ways. He bought out the J.K. Adams, bought that other 50%. He said, the stories he told was, you want to know about debt, obligation, and pressure. He borrowed a lot of money from his father-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
He said, the banks I can deal with, when you owe your father-in-law a lot of money, you got a lot of pressure.
Now there's a very big line here. You do business with with a very famous distributor, right? It's Williams Sonoma. Yeah.
We've been suppliers to Williams Sonoma, Abercrombie and Fitch, Macy's, but Joe and he parted ways. And I said to him one time, many years later, why didn't you change the name? It was only 4 years into the business. He said, I was so broke that I couldn't reprint the stationery, and we had 3 boxes of stationery. And that was true. He was very frugal, and I think that's one of the reasons the company still survives. Dad told me that when they were in production for the diamond cars,
Right.
there was a very simple method of inspiring everybody to stay on task, which was every time a finished Silk City diner moved out of the building, the foreman got a $100 bill. So he didn't have to do anything else. There was no formal time and motion studies. The foreman wanted that. Today that'd be a $1,000 bill.
Mm-hmm.
So he kept everybody on task.
Okay.
The foreman was a hard guy.
All right.
These are just stories I remember from recollection. Payroll was Friday night, Friday evening, and the payroll was handed out in cash and envelopes. And there was a window on, I think the Paterson Vehicle Company was on Market Street or something.
I think so, yeah.
There was a payroll, and one of the brothers would sit there in the window and hand out cash to each employee. And in the window above, another brother sat up there with a shotgun over his knees just to make a statement that this is...
We mean business.
We
mean business.
Because, there was thousands and thousands of dollars in cash.
Yeah.
And those are 2 stories that stick in my mind. He said another one I thought was interesting was there was a ceremony when the final payment was made, and a couple of the brothers would go to the diner site, and when the final payment was made, the paperwork was signed, they detached the wheels. They'd been left on for the whole time that it was being paid for. Mm-hmm. And legally there was some angle that was still rolling stock, still portable. But when the wheels came out, now it's permanent, now you own it, we can't take it back.
Okay.
So there'd be a little ceremony, or like a sort of a reverse ribbon cutting. It's yours, the wheels are now going back, put them under another diner.
Right. Silk City Diners, I think, was probably among the big 3 in New Jersey back in 30s, 40s, 50s. Jerry O'Mahony he's sort of the great-grandfather of New Jersey's diner business. There was a Coleman Company, and I think then Silk City. And as far as I can tell from the research I did, maybe O'Mahony sold about 2,000 diners in his day. Maybe Coleman and Silk City, they maybe sold, again, maybe almost 2,000 diners, but...
Yeah, I saw 1,700.
Yeah, 70, that sounds about right. But Silk City had the thing where, because of their experience with designing and building vehicles, they had a little bit of an edge in terms of manufacturing, and they could give you 3 different sizes if you wanted to. So, yeah.
And my father also, I think, was a little bitter about the final interaction he had with the family when he came out of college. The dining car business, there were clouds on the horizon, dynamics were changing, people were getting more money, restaurants were opening. And his roommate in college went to work for a big international construction firm. He was a civil engineer. Mm-hmm. And so he and his roommate were good buddies, and they stayed buddies for the rest of his life. He became vice president of the Dravo Corporation in Pittsburgh, which helped build the Aswan Dam and built bridges and huge construction projects. And he said, why don't you convert one of those dining cars to a mobile field office? Nobody had done that before. Anybody that set up a huge construction job would build a little building on site, just stick frame, and put the clerk of the works would be there, they'd have some drafting tables and file cabinets and a telephone. He said, it'd be perfect, you can make these and then just pull them onto site. So he goes back, my dad said, just out of college, a young kid, green, and approaches the brothers and said, let me make one of these, let's convert one and see if it sells. And his roommate, John Beidler from Pittsburgh, said, I'm sure I can convince my company to buy the first one. And the brothers said, no, we don't think it's a good idea. They're not going to, a mobile field office. Do you see them around today? Even on a big home site, they wouldn't want to fill up. This would have been the first one. Mm-hmm. So I think that sort of soured my father on their short-sightedness. And the other thing that was happening at the same time, the word was coming around in the world of food and restaurant hospitality. There was a guy over in Boston who was going to franchise a restaurant concept. Their concept was to build this sort of repetitive building, this little sort of looked like a railroad car. But he's going to sell you a concept for the whole restaurant. The layout of the building, the menu, the flavors of ice cream, the parking lot. And the brother said, this guy Howard Johnson's crazy. That'll never work.
I've heard that name before.
So,
yeah, well, see, but who knew back in those days? You never quite know how these things are going to turn out. The diner business did very well, and Silk City was among the ones until it didn't. In the early 60s, that's when fast food started coming east. McDonald's, Burger King.
And
Howard Johnson's and White Castle.
Denny's. And those
yeah. So now, as I recall, they basically, by 1965, the Silk City Diner Company had sort of run its course. Mm-hmm. And the head salesperson, John Grinwis, I believe his name was, okay. and the construction director, Otto Peel, I think his name.
I don't remember any of those names.
Yeah, they said, well, all right, if you're going to sell Silk City, we want to buy the business, and we'll keep going with Silk City Diners. Again, they couldn't get the financing, so there were like maybe 3 or 4 unfinished diners still on the factory floor. I wonder whatever happened to them, I don't know. But by 1965, 66, they had drawn up legal papers for liquidation. And that was the end of the Silk City business.
Yeah, and I think my father also felt that when he decided not to join them and they didn't want to build the field offices, this is in 49 or 50, or maybe a little longer, he said, I want to cash in my stock. Well, in a closely held family business, which I owned, I know how easy it is to put the value on the stock, or to change. In other words, it's very, you can have appraisers. You can get an appraiser to give you, it's worth $5 million, and another appraiser to say it's worth $10 million. Mm-hmm. It's really only worth what you can get somebody to pay you in the end. But when you're trying to put a stock price on a company like the Silk City Diner for an internal transfer, it becomes a very tricky business, and with the family and the emotions. He never talked much about it, but I think he thinks they sort of screwed him out of his share, because his grandfather had given all the boys stock. Mm-hmm. And even though he didn't work in the business, he was given stock. My father did the same thing. My brother ended up with stock in JKM's, and I ended up paying him, and I think I paid him ridiculously too much money. But I figured I only have one brother. I want to get along with my brother, so
it's only money.
You can guess how that might have not rubbed well with him.
Right. Yeah.
So he left. He thought the oldest brother, who was pretty much of a hard-nosed guy, because I think all the brothers had a different, some were in manufacturing, some were in finance, some were in marketing, and they were all had different divisions. And he was particularly fond of Fred, and Fred was sort of a gentle soul, and he felt his oldest brother, Abbott, right? He sort of bullied Fred, and he didn't approve of that. He thought he was a little bit of an autocrat. So, I met various brothers. I met my grandfather just briefly, and I remember he was at the end of his life, and I was a little, so I must have been 3 or 4, and he asked me to jump up in the bed with him, to climb up in the bed and talk to him, and this old guy, probably, falling apart, looking pretty ancient. I said, I don't want to get up there, and I've always felt badly, because, he said, bring my grandson up here, and I said, no, I don't want to. So that was the only time I ever saw him, and met several of the brothers. One was a great bird dog hunter. and had about 6 dogs. Dogs were treated as hunting dogs. They were not pets. They lived in little cages, and that was a different world because our dog always became part of the family. He was, I think it was maybe, not Irving, but maybe Everett was a very good shotgun, competitive trap and skeet. Went to the Nationals every year in Vandalia, Ohio, and won numerous medals as a trap and skeet shooter. Reynold, who died, I think he died of alcoholism. Another one of the brothers was Patton's aide-de-camp in Tunisia in South Africa. And he was sort of the bone pivot of the family, that we Reynold. So that's what little I remember of the family.
The Coopers, they were a great family here in Paterson. Quite an iconic line of people and all the things that they did back in those days.
Kuipers, they were all Kuipers, and they wanted to anglicize it.
Yes.
In the late 1700s, they went from Kuiper to Cooper.
That's right. When we had the exhibit at the Lambert Castle,
Right.
your relatives got together and they figured out who was the original Dutchman who came over and lived in Bergen, which is now today Jersey City. And we found him.
Came on the Beaver.
Yeah, we found him.
I think I got that list.
Yeah, we found him. It's amazing. This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to Paterson. Thank you for sharing these stories. Really appreciate you being here. Good luck.
Thank you.
And have a safe trip back up to Vermont.
I will.
All right.